Welcome to Bookish Mind, Season 3, Episode 15. Today we confront a rising crisis. What happens when emotional education is missing from the lives of our children and teens? This deep dive is all about pulling back the curtain on, well, a hidden epidemic, exploring how emotional illiteracy shapes our society. We'll be unpacking some really compelling sources that not only lay out the staggering costs, but crucially point us toward powerful paths to prevention.
Indeed. And what's really fascinating here is how seemingly disparate societal problems, things like rising violence or pervasive addiction, they often trace back to these fundamental deficits in emotional competence.
Yeah.
We'll look at the data, the poignant stories, and the surprising insights that reveal why emotional literacy might just matter more than we've ever realized. Our mission today is to understand not just what's happening, but why it profoundly impacts you and, well, the world around us.
That's a powerful starting point. And to underscore that, let's begin with a chilling story from Thomas Jefferson High School in Brooklyn. Ian Moore and Tyrone Sinkler, two high schoolers, were tragically shot to death by a scared 15-year-old Khalil Sumter who'd brought a .38 caliber pistol to school. This wasn't just some isolated incident, right? It's a stark, almost visceral example of a desperate need for lessons in handling emotions, in settling disagreements. How typical is this kind of tragedy in reflecting the broader issue of emotional illiteracy?
Well, this incident, tragic as it is, it really serves as a kind of grim bellwether for a broader deficiency, emotional illiteracy. Educators, long accustomed to focusing just on academic standards, they're now confronted with this alarming gap as really an undeniable societal crisis. And the data, particularly for the United States, it paints an even bleaker picture, often sort of foreshadowing global trends in these areas.
And when we dive into those statistics, the picture becomes incredibly stark. It really does. We're talking about the highest juvenile arrest rate for violent crimes ever recorded back in 1990 compared to the previous 2 decades. Teen murder rates quadrupling because of shootings. Teen suicide rates tripled. And the number of child murder victims under 14 also tripled.
Wow.
Beyond that, more and younger teenage girls were getting pregnant. The birth rate for girls aged 10 to 14 rose 5 years in a row as of 1993. And venereal disease rates tripled over 3 decades for teens.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these figures get even more dire for African-American youth, particularly in inner cities where the rates are significantly higher. But beyond just these stark numbers, the problem shows up in more subtle ways too, right? Equally damaging ways. A national study of American children aged 7 to 16 from the mid-70s to the late 80s, it revealed this steady decline across critical emotional indicators. Children increasingly struggle with things like social withdrawal, anxiety and depression, attention difficulties, and aggressive or delinquent behaviors.
So what becomes strikingly clear is that these aren't isolated incidents or, separate issues. They seem to be symptoms of a foundational breakdown in emotional resilience, a kind of sea change permeating childhood itself, and it's happening globally.
A new kind of toxicity, as the sources put it.
Exactly. This new kind of toxicity isn't just a byproduct of modern life, but maybe a direct consequence of this silent epidemic, emotional illiteracy. And like you said, it's not just an American problem. Studies worldwide show similar or even worse levels of emotional malaise in places like Australia, France, Thailand. And importantly, no children are exempt. These problems are universal, cutting across all ethnic, racial, and income groups.
Which raises that critical question, why? Why is this happening on such a global scale? Developmental psychologists like Yuri Bronfenbrenner, they point to external stresses on families. Things like the hecticness, the instability, the inconsistency of daily life, the loss of traditional support systems, and these big global economic forces driving parents to work longer hours.
Right. Less time for those interactions.
Exactly. It directly leads to an erosion of those countless small, nourishing exchanges between parent and child that are absolutely vital for building emotional competence. Then you add increased poverty, the rise of the one-parent family, poorly run daycare. It's like a systemic depletion of the emotional firm footing children need for life.
Okay, let's get specific now with how these deficits actually play out in individual lives. Think about the classic school bully. The sources describe a kid named Jimmy who is in jail for assault by 16. And what's particularly insightful here is that flagrant childhood aggressiveness isn't just a phase they grow out of, right? It's a strong predictor of future troubles. Can you elaborate a bit on how these early patterns often escalate?
Absolutely. Studies clearly show a lifelong legacy for these children. Their family lives often involve, well, parental neglect combined with harsh, kind of capricious punishments. And a key perceptual flaw seems to unite many aggressive children. They misinterpret neutral acts as hostile. They imagine slights where none were intended.
Like an innocent bump.
Exactly. An innocent bump might be seen as a deliberate vendetta, leading to immediate lashing out.
So the core implication here is that their reaction is just automatic hostility. They don't consider alternatives like, I don't know, politeness or joking about it.
Right.
And these perceptual biases are apparently in place by the early grades, often by second grade. Aggressive kids fail to learn self-control, relying on force over negotiation. And they get rejected by peers incredibly quickly, sometimes within just, 2 or 3 hours of first contact on a playground.
It's fast.
Yeah.
And this early aggression has a very clear trajectory. Studies show that up to half of first graders who are disruptive, unable to get along, disobedient, they become delinquents in their teens. And there was this study in Montreal. Kindergartners, rated highest for hostility and troublemaking, were about 3 times more likely to admit to various delinquent acts by their early teens. Things like beating someone up, shoplifting, using a weapon, breaking into cars, being drunk, all before age 14. And impulsivity in 10-year-old boys, get this, is almost 3 times more powerful a predictor of later delinquency than IQ.
3 times more powerful than IQ. That's staggering. And what about for girls on this kind of trajectory?
Well, instead of violence, typically, the sources state that 40% of bad fourth-grade girls, meaning those getting in trouble with teachers, breaking rules, though not necessarily unpopular with peers, had a child by the time they finished high school.
40%.
40%. That's 3 times the average pregnancy rate for girls in their schools. So it shows a different but equally troubling outcome for these unaddressed emotional issues. It highlights how broadly these deficits manifest.
Okay, so beyond aggression, another major cost you mentioned is depression.
Yes. Consider Dana, a 16-year-old described in the sources. She struggled with relationships, felt hopeless, considered suicide after a breakup. Her depression was fundamentally triggered by an inability to handle relationships, not knowing how to end unsatisfying ones or how to set sexual boundaries. She admitted going to bed with boys when all she really wanted was like a deeper connection, and she felt shy about making friends with girls.
So relationship problems are a huge trigger for depression in young people. And it's not just with peers, right? It's also with their parents.
That's right. Depressed children often can't accurately label their feelings. They show this kind of sullen irritability, impatience, crankiness, anger instead, which of course makes it harder for parents to offer support. They don't know what's really going on.
And what's really compelling about the new research you mentioned is how it pinpoints deficits in relationship skills and a depression-promoting way of interpreting setbacks as the root causes.
Exactly. And we are seeing a modern epidemic of depression spreading right alongside the adoption of modern ways of life. Each successive generation worldwide since the early 1900s has lived with a higher risk of suffering a major depression. And the episodes are beginning at earlier and earlier ages. Childhood depression, which was once virtually unknown, is really emerging as a fixture of the modern scene.
So what are the leading theories about why this is happening?
Well, experts offer several ideas. Dr. Frederick Goodwin pointed to a tremendous erosion of the nuclear family. Doubling divorce rates, less parental time, increased mobility, less extended family around. Dr. David Kupfer noted growing parental indifference to children's needs that came with industrialization. And the psychologist Martin Seligman proposed the ascendance of individualism and a waning of larger beliefs, things like religion, supports from community, extended family, which leads to this profound loss of meaning when facing failure.
So it's a combination of factors, potentially.
It seems so. And critically, childhood depression isn't something kids just grow out of. It often leads to more severe and recurring episodes later in life. Major episodes last about 11 months on average.
11 months, that's huge.
Huge social and academic costs, too. Depressed kids are often socially inept, have fewer friends, are less liked. Their memory and concentration are impaired. It makes it harder to pay attention in class, harder to retain what's taught. The longer children were depressed, the more their grades dropped. It's a clear correlation.
Okay, another subtle yet devastating cost you mentioned earlier, eating disorders.
Yes. The sources talk about the historical context, how anorexia and bulimia only really started to be clinically commented on in the late 1960s. There was a key study of over 900 girls, grades 7 to 10. It found that emotional deficits, especially a failure to tell distressing feelings apart from one another and to control them, were central factors leading to eating disorders.
Failure to tell feelings apart. How does that work?
Well, girls with eating disorders reacted to setbacks, difficulties, even minor annoyances with these really intense negative feelings that they couldn't soothe. And they had less awareness of what exactly they were feeling. So when this difficulty was coupled with being highly dissatisfied with their body, the outcome was often anorexia or bulimia.
So the core issue is an inability to distinguish between feelings like, say, fear, anger, or actual hunger.
Exactly. They often lump them all together as signifying hunger. This leads to overeating, or sometimes restriction, as a way to feel some control over these overwhelming emotions, which means effective treatments demonstrably need to include remedial instruction in these basic emotional skills.
That makes sense. Okay, and then there's the insidious issue of social rejection and dropping out of school. The sources give that really poignant example of Ben, the fourth grader. When rejected by his friend Jason, he yelled, refused to talk, ran off to hide, just nursing his wounds defiantly alone. His inability to respond to efforts to repair the friendship is sadly typical, isn't it, of unpopular children who are poor at reading emotional and social signals.
Very typical. Socially rejected children often struggle to read those signals, and they have a very limited repertoire of responses. And this is critical because the dropout rate for children rejected by their peers is between 2 and 8 times greater than for children who actually have friends.
2 to 8 times greater.
Yes. Their awkwardness repeatedly makes people uncomfortable, which leads to social isolation. These children often send off emotional signals. They're awkward. They give self-defeating answers in social situations. Like, for example, responding, punch him, when asked what to do if both children wanted the same toy. Their social incompetence tragically becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy.
The consequences of being on the social margins are just huge then.
Absolutely huge. Friendships are the crucible, right? That's where children really refine social and emotional skills. Unpopularity in third grade has even been shown to be a better predictor of mental health problems at age 18 than anything else.
Anything else.
Including
Including.
teachers and nurses' ratings, school performance, IQ, psychological tests. Better than all of those.
Wow.
And we know that loneliness in later life dramatically increases the risk for medical diseases and even early death.
Okay, finally, let's connect emotional illiteracy to substance abuse.
Right. We see widespread binge drinking among students to blackout, disturbingly high rates of heavy drinking in college. About 2/5 of male college students downing 7 or more drinks at a time, according to the sources.
Is there more?
The sources reveal that for many, substance use is essentially a form of self-medication. It's a chemical fix to soothe feelings of anxiety, anger, or depression. Those who stay with the habit are using substances as this long-term destructive way to cope with long-standing emotional distress.
It's truly a devil's bargain, isn't it? A short-term good feeling for the steady meltdown of your life.
Precisely. And different emotional patterns actually seem to drive different addictions. For example, highly strung, anxious individuals often find alcohol calms them. This might be linked to specific brain chemistry, like an imbalance in GABA, the neurotransmitter that helps calm the brain.
Okay.
Others, maybe with high agitation, impulsivity, boredom, they find alcohol soothes their restlessness. And this leads to a propensity to try a whole random list of drugs besides alcohol.
And what about other drugs?
Well, chronic unhappiness can drive addiction to stimulants like cocaine, which provide a direct antidote, sort of, to feeling depressed. Chronic anger might lead to addiction to opioids like heroin, which offer a sense of normalcy and relaxation for those individuals. But while there might be biological predispositions, the key insight here is that acquiring the ability to handle those feelings, soothing anxiety, lifting depression, calming rage, that removes the impetus to use drugs or alcohol in the first place.
Which is where we find the opportunity for prevention.
Exactly. This is where we find a profound opportunity for prevention.
And that brings us to the good news, which feels immensely hopeful after discussing all those costs. There is every sign that teaching children more productive ways of looking at their difficulties lowers their risk of depression and these other severe outcomes.
Absolutely.
This isn't just about wars on drugs or violence. Those approaches often come too late, don't they?
Way too late.
We need prevention. Offering our children the skills for facing life that will dramatically increase their chances of avoiding any and all of these fates.
Precisely. And there are concrete examples. For aggressive children, programs like the one at Duke University worked with anger-ridden elementary schoolers. They had training sessions, 40 minutes, twice a week. The boys were taught, for example, to see how some social cues they interpreted as hostile were actually neutral or friendly.
Reinterpreting the cues.
Yes. They learned to take the perspective of other children. They got direct training in anger control through enacting scenes and monitoring their feelings, like noticing flushing or muscle tensing, as a cue to stop and consider what to do next. And the results. 3 years after the training, these boys were much less disruptive in class, had more positive feelings about themselves, and were significantly less likely to drink or take drugs.
That's a significant impact. And for depression, are there similar success stories?
Yes. In an Oregon high school study, a special after-school class taught 75 mildly depressed students. They learned to challenge thinking patterns associated with depression, become more adept at making friends, get along better with parents, engage in more social activities. After just 8 weeks, a remarkable 55% recovered, compared to about a quarter of equally depressed students who weren't in the program.
55% recovery in 8 weeks.
And a year later, the program cut the risk of major depression by nearly half.
Incredible.
And similar promising findings came from a once-a-week class for 10 to 13-year-olds, showing early signs of depression. They learned basic emotional skills: handling disagreements, thinking before acting, challenging pessimistic beliefs, like resolving to study harder after doing poorly on an exam instead of thinking, oh, I'm just not smart enough.
Changing that internal narrative.
Exactly. As Martin Seligman put it, moods like anxiety, sadness, and anger don't just descend on you without your having any control over them, but that you can change the way you feel by what you think. It essentially served as a psychological inoculation.
That's truly inspiring. So what about those socially rejected children, the Bens of the world we discussed earlier? Is there hope there, too, for building those crucial friendship skills?
There absolutely is hope. Programs like Stephen Asher's friendship coaching for 3rd and 4th graders are a great example. These programs taught children how to be friendly, fun, and nice. Practical things like thinking of alternative suggestions and compromises, talking with and asking questions about the other child, listening, smiling, offering help.
Basic social skills, really.
Exactly. And these interventions moved them from being the least liked kids to solidly in the middle of classroom popularity within just a year.
Wow, that's a big shift.
And Stephen Nowicki's program trains social outcasts to hone their ability to read and respond appropriately to other children's feelings, using things like videotaping to practice emotional expressiveness. These programs show about a 50 to 60% success rate in raising the popularity of rejected children, especially for 3rd and 4th graders who are more socially inept rather than highly aggressive.
So it powerfully demonstrates that many rejected children can indeed be brought into the circle of friendship with some basic emotional coaching.
Definitely.
And for addiction, where self-medication is so prevalent,
The message remains consistent. While, yes, predisposition can be brain-based, Alcoholics Anonymous and other recovery programs have demonstrated for decades that acquiring the ability to handle feeling soothing anxiety, lifting depression, calming rage, removes the impetus to use drugs or alcohol. These basic emotional skills are taught remedially in treatment programs, but as you can imagine, it would be far, far better if they were learned early in life, well before the habit ever became established.
which brings us to that crucial, maybe even counterintuitive point. Information is not enough.
Right.
Take the example of sexual abuse prevention programs. As of 1993, the sources say there were about 200,000 substantiated cases reported annually in the U.S. Estimates suggest between 20–30% of girls and maybe half that number of boys are victims by age 17. Huge numbers.
Disturbing numbers.
However, a national survey found that basic training focused only on information like good versus bad touching was little better than nothing, or actually worse.
Yes, how so?
Children who had only those basic programs and who subsequently became victims were half as likely to report it afterward than those who had no programs at all.
That is really eye-opening. So what worked then? What made the difference?
More comprehensive training, given at different levels, several times over the course of a child's school career, and crucially, with parental involvement.
Parental involvement.
Children whose parents participated were the very best at resisting threats of sexual abuse. But most importantly, social and emotional competences made the real difference.
Exactly. It's not enough for a child simply to know about good and bad touching. Children need the self-awareness to know when a situation feels wrong or distressing. They need enough self-confidence and assertiveness to trust and act on those feelings, and they need a repertoire of ways to disrupt what's about to happen, everything from running away to threatening to tell.
So the better programs taught actual skills.
Yes, they taught children to stand up for what they want, assert their rights, defend their boundaries. They also taught children how to solve interpersonal conflicts more positively, to have more self-confidence, not to blame themselves if something happened, and to feel they had a network of support in teachers and parents.
And this next finding feels like a crucial turning point. A 5-year project by the W.T. Grant Foundation identified the active ingredients of truly effective prevention programs, regardless of the specific problem they targeted. And the list, remarkably, reads just like the essential ingredients of emotional intelligence.
Which raises an important question for all of us, right?
Yeah.
What are these core emotional skills that prove so universally effective? Well, they include self-awareness, identifying, expressing, and managing feelings, impulse control, knowing the difference between feelings and actions, identifying alternatives before acting, and managing anxiety.
And interpersonal skills, too.
Interpersonal competences are absolutely key. Reading social and emotional cues, listening effectively, being able to resist negative influences, taking others' perspectives, and understanding what behavior is acceptable in a situation. These aren't just soft skills. These are fundamental life skills that build a powerful core of resilience.
And it's vital to understand, isn't it, that these skills are not a denial of other serious risk factors, like growing up in poverty or a chaotic family,
Not at all.
but they are decisive in determining resilience. Long-term studies show that children brought up in really difficult circumstances, poverty, abusive families, parent with severe mental illness, those who are resilient even in the face of the most grinding hardships, they tend to share key emotional skills.
What kind of skills?
Things like a winning sociability, self-confidence, and optimistic persistence even when facing failure and frustration, the ability to recover quickly from upsets, and just an easygoing nature.
Resilience built on emotional competence.
Exactly. So what does this all mean for you, our listener? This deep dive has shown us that the costs of emotional illiteracy in our youth are, well, profound. They manifest as violence, depression, addiction, social isolation. But the truly good news, the hopeful part, is that these aren't inevitable fates.
Absolutely. The insights from these sources offer a clear, actionable pathway forward.
Mm-hmm.
Proactively teaching emotional and social skills, these active ingredients of emotional intelligence, it really serves as a kind of psychological inoculation. It's about empowering children to navigate life's inevitable challenges, to soothe their own distress, and to connect with others effectively, well before problems escalate into crises.
It really challenges us to look beyond the quick fixes, doesn't it? To see the immense long-term value in nurturing emotional competence right from an early age.
Definitely. What stands out for you here listening to all this, perhaps it's the realization that while some qualities might seem innate, temperament can actually change for the better with the right support and focused learning. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling thought, I think. If we can teach children to read and write, imagine the transformative power we unlock by teaching them to read and manage their own hearts and minds.